So welcome all today. Thank you for joining us. My name is Ryan Anderson. I'm the outreach manager here at Kendal at Home. With us today in the background, we have Sue Woykin, who will be handling all the behind the scenes stuff for us today on the Zoom, along with Paul Duffy. Today we have a very special guest with us, Mr. Russell Gurr. Mr. Gurr is an Australian conductor based in New York. And his broad repertoire spans orchestral, operatic, and choral music, which he's conducted across the world, Europe, North America, and his home country, Australia. And so since 2016, Mr. Gurr has been the musical director of the Greater Newburgh Symphony Orchestra in the Hudson Valley region of New York, where he conducts 6 subscription concerts each season, in addition to family and pop concerts. So Mr. Gurr, thank you so much for joining us again. I know we've had you in the past, and we're really looking forward to hearing this. I think we titled it a Whirlwind Tour, which 1,000 years I feel like feels like a whirlwind tour. So
it is 1,000 years in 60 minutes. Ryan, thanks very much. I am going to now share my screen so you can all see the slideshow. Can you see that?
Yep.
Okay, welcome to 1,000 years in 60 minutes. This is no small feat to get it done in that time. So let's start jumping in the medieval period in roughly 1100, and it goes for about 1400. What you'll notice as we go through the progress of time, that the periods become shorter and shorter because communication becomes better and better, and so the world seems to become smaller and smaller. The image that I've chosen for the medieval period is the 3 dominant professions that were available to men of the day. On the left, we have the priesthood. On the right, we have the serf or the servant, or the field worker who wasn't a landowner but worked a small plot of land. And in the center, we have the knight, which is representative of the aristocracy. Those were the 3 pillars on which society was built at the time, on the church and on the aristocracy and on a working class. The forefather of music is not actually a forefather, it's a foremother. The first music for which we have any kind of written notation is from Hildegard of Bingen. Hildegard was a very devout nun, but she was also an extraordinary woman who is regarded by historians as one of the founders of natural science. She was also crippled frequently by searing migraines, during which she would have religious visions. What Hildegard started to do was to compose music as a way of expressing some of these divine visions that she had. But what was interesting about her notation, this is an example of modern notation. It's the very beginning of Beethoven's Sonata number 27, number 2, which is commonly known as the Moonlight. And what you will notice is there are 2 staves, there are bar lines, there are dynamics, the little PP in the middle. You'll see there's a tempo marking. You'll see that there's a key signature. You'll see there are clefs. By comparison, Hildegard's music was only written down after the fact. And you'll notice that it's only 4 lines instead of 5. There's no key signature. There's no time signature. There are no bar lines. It's dictated purely from the flow of the words. And you'll notice that even the notes themselves are not note heads like we know them, as you see here. They are these kind of slightly ambiguous notations. They are called neumes. And the neumes dictated the general shape of the music, but which meant that you had to have heard it in order to perform it. So here's an example of Hildegard's. So you can see that it follows the contour and the outline of the shape, but it gives little more information than that. We then time jump forward 300 years because we have no time to dally. And we now arrive in the Renaissance period, which is roughly 300 years after the medieval period. roughly 1400 to 1600. And the image I've chosen is, of course, the centerpiece of the roof of the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. One of the composers of the day that is most revered is Josquin de Prez, who was a Franco-Flemishman who lived from the middle of the 15th century to the early 16th century. And what you'll notice about Josquin's music is that instead of being in one voice, monophony, monophone, mono meaning one, phone meaning voice, instead of being in monophony like Hildegard's, it's now in polyphony, poly meaning many voices. The harmony has evolved now. We're starting to hear voice against voice, note against note, which creates the phenomenon of harmony. We've also got this, what we call counterpoint or contrapuntal music, where the notes move independently against each other. So instead of what we're going to see at a later time, where one voice supports another, these voices operate kind of independently around each other, and the magical result is how beautiful it sounds together. Again, like Hildegard's, it is vocal in nature, and like Hildegard's, it is religious in nature. Have a look at this example from Josquin. These dovetailing sequential entries. Incredibly beautiful, I'm sure you'll agree. Now we have to time jump another 100 years and we arrive at the Baroque period. The Baroque period is roughly from the start of the 17th century, 1600, to the middle of the 18th century, 1750. And that's roughly, Bach is born in the middle of it, and he becomes an exemplar of what's called the High Baroque. The image that I've chosen is of this very, very ornate keyboard instrument known as the harpsichord. You can see that there's a painting on the inside of the lid. You can see that the legs are decorated with this very ornate carving all around. You can see that the side also has panels of paintings. The Baroque period, Barroco in Portuguese, means deformed pearl. And what that meant was something that was very ornate, very lush, very lavish. And Bach becomes the exemplar of this compositional style, which is again polyphonic, like the music of Josquin, but we're now moving into instrumental music. Bach is a very religious man. He has 21 children. He is the music director in a German city called Kürten, where he is the head of the church, is the cantor. He runs the choir. He's got a small orchestra. But he also starts to compose secular music, which is a development of music away from the soul under the auspices of the church. We're now starting to see music written outside of worship music. The example that we're going to listen to is Bach's Little Fugue in G minor for organ. What you're going to see is this wonderful rendering that I found online, where it's not the musical notation, but it's in fact a visual rendering in color of all the four voices that you will see. This is called a fugue. Fugare in Italian means to flee. And what it means is that one voice tries to run away from the other. And again, what happens as a result is this wonderful intertwining of various rather independent melodies to form the overall picture. Enjoy this. Second voice. what you will no doubt have noticed is that from Hildegard's single monophonic line through to Josquin's counterpoint, where the melody was Kyrie eleison, from that to Bach's very complex, very ornate da dee da 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 dee da dee 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 dee. We're seeing this continued evolution of complexity and sophistication as we move forward in time. Now, we don't need to jump forward 100 years anymore, because what starts to happen as technology gets better and as the world starts to knit itself closer together is that the periods begin to dovetail. So at the end of the Baroque period is the beginning of the classical period, and that wasn't necessarily the case in previous times. So we have this image here of the classical period where we've got this emblem of justice, because the classical period becomes the age of reason. We have the birth of Immanuel Kant and the idea that everything needs to be scientifically thought through. We have the decentralization of the earth under Copernicus. We have the decentralization of the church from the center of everyone's life. Now, the most well-regarded composer from this early classical period is the young, prodigiously talented Wolfgang Mozart. And Mozart moves, as we're going to start to see, the pendulum swings from one eon to another. And whereas we had this high ornate complexity in the Bach with multiple voices operating independently, we now start to see a texture emerge called homophony, homo meaning the same, phone meaning sound or voice. And so we have a chung 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 kind of accompaniment with a very noticeable melody. What you will recognize is that this is the texture that dominates all pop music that we grew up with a guitar or a piano in the background and a voice lyrically singing over the top of it. It emanates from the classical period. The other primary aesthetic of the classical period is the idea of symmetry, balance, and proportion, which is directly Newtonian, if you think about it. Newton said what goes up must come down. So if you think about the beginning of Eine kleine Nachtmusik, dum, da, dum, da, 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 dim, it's gone up. It has to have balance and symmetry. Dum, ba, bum, ba, 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 bum. It comes down. The example we're going to listen to is me with my orchestra performing one of Mozart's very early symphonies, number 25, when he was only 17 years old. It's written in a style called Sturm und Drang, which means storm and stress, which was a literary style that was supposed to be highly charged and dramatic. And remember that Mozart's greatest ambition is to become an opera composer. So here he is testing his mettle, trying to create as much drama as he can in an instrumental setting. Here we go. Contrast, drama, and then So what you can see is this overarching desire to create symmetry, balance, and contrast. When we then jump into the Romantic period, which depending on which author you're reading, depends on when they start the Romantic period. The emblem of the Romantic period that I've given you here is of the Greek god Dionysus, who is the god of ecstasy and the god of wine. And the reason for that is because the Romantic period, in contrast to the kind of Apollonian restraint, balance, and form of the classical period, the Romantic period is all about individualism. It's all about individual, creative, personal, unique expression, inspired by this kind of divine moment of ecstasy. Now, depending on which historian you're reading, depends on when the Romantic period starts. I find the beginning of the 19th century, 1800, to be a useful place because it divides Haydn and Mozart, the classical composers, from the bridging composer, who is, of course, none other than Ludwig van Beethoven, who lays the foundation stone for everything that's going to come in the rest of the 19th century. Beethoven starts to write with a much more detailed form of notation. The instruments start to grow, the orchestra starts to grow, everything expands outwards. The forms, the themes, the harmony, the orchestra, and Beethoven becomes the past master of expectation and denial. And of course, there has now been a complete shift away from any religious music. It's entirely instrumental and it's entirely secular. Now, this particular piece gives birth to two mythologies. The first is one that is going to leave a mark for more than a century to come, which is this narrative conducted purely in instrumental terms of darkness to light, from minor to major, darkness to light, or as Beethoven referred to it, Kampf und Sieg, struggle and triumph. And what he's able to do is to tell a story that is both universal and personal at the same time. He's able to tell the story of any difficulty, any challenge that you need to surmount and overcome, and by doing so, he gives hope. We then move into towards the end. So we've now heard the da-da-da-dam, which is the trial, it's the Kampf, it's the struggle. We move into a fog, which then turns into this upward, ever upward reaching hope and yearning. We are then saved by the brass, who are reserved for this moment in time. I told you the orchestra kept growing. He reserves the piccolo, the three trombones, and the double bassoon for the very end, to give an expanded harmonic palette and to give the orchestra a sense, the audience a sense of the greater gravity, the greater power of the orchestra at the moment of great breakthrough and transcendence. Have a listen how we grope our way through the fog, yearn towards the light, and then eventually achieve transcendence. This murky uncertainty, stasis, after all this animated movement, hesitancy, uncertainty, groping, trying to move and upward, hope. We might transcend this yet. musicians from thenceforth an ability to do is to tell a narrative story just in sound. It also is an example of how Beethoven recycles that little cell, da 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 da. It absolutely saturates the first movement, and it makes these small little subtle appearances in every subsequent movement, knitting the whole thing together. Composers for generations after Beethoven are going to look at the fifth as a model for how to tell stories in sound and how to unify these ever increasing and ever growing symphonic structures. The long shadow that Beethoven casts has a multitude of effects. The generation that directly follows him in the post-Beethoven era is Schubert, whom Beethoven himself anointed as the inheritor of his mantle. Beethoven dies in 1827. Tragically, Schubert dies in 1828, the very next year, at the age of only 31 from syphilis. The other composers are Mendelssohn and Schumann. Mendelssohn and Schumann continue to compose as if Beethoven had never written the Ninth Symphony, had never really gone beyond that middle period of the Fifth Symphony. They ignore everything that happens afterwards. Chopin he leaps off from something like the Moonlight Sonata and composes exclusively piano music, much of it very contemplative and very private. Berlioz, the bottom right-hand fiery Frenchman, becomes the real impetus to go from Beethoven into the next era of musical development. Everything becomes more individual in his hands. Everything continues to expand. The orchestra, the form, the material, the harmony, the chromaticism, everything expands, but it also continues to contract. Schubert and Schumann wrote an enormous number of lieder, small chamber pieces for just the piano and a voice. And they are these miniature operas that only last for about 3 minutes. And that is the contraction and distillation of form. And then Berlioz is the opposite extreme and expands everything to gargantuan enormity. So everything becomes either emulation or denial in one way of Beethoven. The next level of telling stories or narratives in sound comes from Berlioz, who just 3 years after Beethoven dies composes a wild piece of music called the Symphonie Fantastique, which means the fantastical symphony, for which he writes a story. He says, an artist of unnaturally sentimental and soft disposition tries to take his life because he's forlorn and in a situation of unrequited love. He tries to overdose on opium, but instead of overdosing, he only takes a non-lethal dose and has this series of completely bizarre visions and hallucinations. This is the beginning of the Symphonie Fantastique. That's his heart seeing the girl. He gets more and more excited. He's going to go up and talk to her. He's going to say something. His heart's beating wildly now. And then he loses courage and walks away. And defeated. Now, I'm going to play that to you again because this portrait of the demure, reticent, and shy object of his affection and desire is also matched by this intrusion of verismo, of reality, of this heartbeat, dudum, 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 which gets faster and faster as he paints the scene of trying to approach the girl and then chickening out at the last minute. I want you to listen to the theme again. Da 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 da. So it's about getting up the courage. It's this simultaneous dual portrait. It's so interesting of both the girl and the guy's experience of trying to approach the girl or of seeing the girl. So, da 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 dum, filled with hope. Then it collapses. Da 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 da-dum, 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 da-dum. Then he tries again. Da 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 dee da da. And what you'll notice is this constant rising and falling, rising and falling. Yes, I can do it. No, I can't. Yes, I can. No, I can't. Have a listen again. Then we have one of the most remarkable feats of creativity that has huge later implications, which is this idea of thematic transformation, where Berlioz takes this reticent, demure, and shy theme, which is called the fixed idea, the idée fixe, and makes it completely manic and delirious. And instead of the silvery flute and the demure violins, it's now trumpets who are core and raucous and crass. Strings are spinning, dizzying, spinning and dizzying all over the place. And there's just this rambunctious noise as he becomes completely manic and delirious at the end of the movement. That's the same theme. As you can imagine, that took the world by storm. People didn't know what to make of it because it was so forward thinking. We then move from Berlioz, the next direct link, and this is a fascinating moment in music history, where the triumvirate of middle high romanticism is a Frenchman, a Hungarian, and a German. Typically throughout history, we have focuses on one genre that comes from one country. When Beethoven is superseded in the 18 teens by a particular, the latest craze in Vienna, it was Italian opera, which was Rossini, Donizetti, and Bellini. When Bach was superseded in the middle of the 18th century, it was by a German art form, an Austrian art form of Mozart and Haydn and later Beethoven, of the symphony. It's very unusual that we would have a triumvirate, an international triumvirate of new wave thinkers that were going to take music in a new direction. So the person that is most impacted by Berlioz's innovations is Richard Wagner. Wagner, in the middle of the 19th century, continues to expand the orchestra, as had Berlioz. He takes from Berlioz this idea of music being able to mean something very specific. It's no longer the generic struggle and triumph of Beethoven. It's now, this is a woman. This is a demure woman. This is a manic response to not getting the girl or to getting the girl. So it's telling increasingly detailed stories in sound. Wagner takes that and assimilates it. He also creates a technique that he learns from Berlioz of unending melody, unendliche Melodie. When you listen to Mozart, dum da 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 da, da dee da dee da dum, dee 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 da da dum, they're rhyming couplets. It's like poetry. We now move through the vehicle of Berlioz into Wagner, into musical prose. We start to emphasize chromatic notes, not as passing, but as melodic in and of themselves. We then have a fascinating causal effect in the middle of Wagner's life. Wagner, in the 1840s, late 1840s and early 1850s, stops composing to write a manifesto called Oper und Drama, which is opera and drama. And he says that we've got to stop calling them operas. Operas are now a defunct art form, as is the symphony. We now have to synthesize all art forms into what he calls the Gesamtkunstwerk, the total or complete artwork, and we're going to call them music dramas. Wagner had a huge ego on him, and one of the ways that he was a relentless and brilliant self-promoter. And of course, he becomes his own librettist, so he writes his own poetry, turgid and stilted as it is. He designs the sets. He integrates as much as possible the music and the drama, and that is no mean feat. But the other thing is that he stops showing the action on the stage and they talk about it at great verbose length, which is why his operas usually take, one opera will take a week to perform. Not really, it's like 5 hours. But still, they are very, very long and in-depth and philosophical explorations of ideas. In the middle of writing his great magnum opus, which is a tetralogy, 4 operas called The Ring Cycle, he gives up in despair halfway through the 3rd opera. He says, you know what? I've got dragons, I've got a heavenly upper world, I've got the Middle Earth, and I've got caves beneath, I've got swimming maidens, I've got the Rhine River. This is impossible to stage. No one's ever going to have the money to do it. The orchestra part is difficult. The singing is difficult. They are so he just gave up. He'd been working on it for 15 years. None of it had ever been performed. At the same time, he was living under the auspices of a silk merchant and his wife who were named the Wesendonks. The Wesendonks were self-made bourgeois, but now upper middle class, but it's not the same as being born an aristocrat. So one of the ways to gain access to the upper echelon of society was to sponsor artists, because it showed your noblesse oblige. Wagner falls head over heels for the pretty young wife of the silk merchant, puts away the ring, and instead writes an opera which is all about unfulfilled longing and yearning and love, which is called Tristan und Isolde, which is based on the Celtic folk story which predates Romeo and Juliet. And it is filled from the very, very outset with 2 themes that were going to change the course of music history. The first is this upward reaching and then collapsing theme of longing. Da, dee, da. It rises, and then as it grows, da, dee, da, it collapses onto this crunchy, uncomfortable, dissonant chord. The desire motif, da, 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 is again this chromatic upward yearning and reaching. And when the 2 are combined and followed by the deafening silence that follows in their wake, and then intensified by moved up, and then intensified by moved up, you have a sequence that is going to change the future of music history. Silence in that unfulfilled, unresolved chord. Higher now, more intense. Piquant crunch of the woodwinds. Unresolved chord hanging in the air, silent. Higher still, more intense. And then the ending, which, having delayed resolution as a metaphor for the entirety of the 4-hour opera, at the very end, he recalls that same motif which has subtly permeated the entire opera and the entire drama, and at the very end, finally, gives us a moment of resolution. Growing ecstasy. Isolde stands over the dead body of her beloved sister. She is being transfigured in that moment. And finally, resolution. Debussy, the great French composer, famously quipped, who began as a musician under the spell of Wagner and then turned completely away from his influence, said that Wagner's great sprawling dramas for the stage, these music dramas, were a beautiful sunset that were mistaken for a dawn. What he meant was that people looked at these things as the new art form. That's certainly how Wagner himself sold them to the world. Did people continue to compose in this manner after Wagner? Debussy was arguing no. He wasn't entirely right. He was also prone to hyperbole for the purposes of this argument. But we then move from Wagner to modernity and the resistance of modernity in what we call German post-romanticism, the end of an era. The post-romantic is the fin de siècle, which means the end of the cycle, the end of an era. It's when there's a tectonic shift in society and its structure. In the late 1800s, in the Habsburg Empire of Austro-Hungary, there was the great white hope of the entire population was Archduke Rudolf, who greatly believed in the middle class and in democracy and in the ushering in of all of modern technology, including electric street lamps, because Vienna still was lighting their lamps nightly with a gas torch. Mahler famously said that when the end of the world comes, he wants to be in Vienna because surely it will come there last, because everything in Vienna happens 30 years too late. The zeitgeist of this time is one filled with nostalgia and pessimism and fear and uncertainty and denial of the impending future. The Archduke Rudolf was so dismayed and disheartened by how difficult it was to try and move people forward that he took his mistress to the Vienna woods, to one of their estates, and they entered into a suicide pact and they both killed themselves. Within this zeitgeist and this culture and this milieu of pessimism and fear and uncertainty emerge the great thinkers like Sigmund Freud and the great composers, the great psychological composers, Richard Strauss and Gustav Mahler, both of whom are direct inheritors of Wagner's mantle. What we have is a complete maximalization. The biggest, grandest that music will ever come to be is in the hands of these two composers. This is the end of Mahler's epic Second Symphony named The Resurrection, where a gargantuan chorus with a huge orchestra is declaiming in a model directly based on Beethoven 5, da-da-da-dum, beginning in struggle and ending in triumph. Auferstehen, ja, auferstehen. Arise again, and you will be born unto God on the wings that you have won for yourself. Much as I would love to sit and watch the end of that because it's one of my favorite pieces ever, we must move on, and we are thrust into modernism, and I've called it the escape from Teutonic hegemony. What does that mean? Teutonic is German, Prussian. The symphony was their primary vehicle, and hegemony is the unquestioned dominance with which they ruled the musical world. And so, remember I told you it was strange that we had this triumvirate of Frenchman, Hungarian, and German. And what we have now is a displacement of the Austro-Hungarian tradition with a new wave of composers led by Igor Stravinsky, the Russian who resides in Paris, and Claude Debussy, the Frenchman. Their notation becomes incredibly detailed. The orchestra expands even further. The textures become incredibly intricate and interwoven. But instead of the rigorous logic of a symphony, we have a displacement that becomes entirely fluid and spontaneous. Debussy starts to compose instrumental music that are reflective of dreams or of random tangents of thought. It becomes asymmetrical and unpredictable. And that's exactly how Stravinsky composes his ballets as well. The first piece we're going to look at is 1894, the dawn of the 20th century, with the Debussy's Afternoon of a Faun, which are these meanderings and reveries based on a friend Mallarmé's poem. And it's all about how evanescent it is. There are no clear melodies. There are no clear phrases. It all kind of moves in this amorphous, evanescent fashion. Have a listen. Nary a place on which to hang your ear, nary a melody to hang your ear on. It's all this amorphous nebulousness, the very definition of anti-German kind of writing. There is a German-speaking composer, the avant-garde and revolutionary composer, the reluctant revolutionary, Arnold Schoenberg. This is a self-portrait that he painted. And in 1912, he writes a cabaret piece called Pierrot Lunaire, which means the crazy or the loon-crazed clown, which has 21 small vignettes based on poems with the speaker declaiming rather than singing. And what we have here is a completely atonal wash, where instead of having the hierarchy, again, of German key systems, we now have the emancipation of dissonance, where every note is equal to every other note. Have a listen to this strange sounding performance piece. Very strange, I'm sure you'll agree. It still is strange now, but it again had huge lasting impact on composers in later years about how to distill from the hugeness of Mahler down to the smallness of Pierrot Lunaire. It gave composers a great scope to be able to be creative. In 1913, one of the most famous musical riots of all time on the Champs-Élysées Theatre, because people could not understand, nor did they desire to understand, the sophisticated barbarism of Stravinsky's The Rite of Spring, which was an elevation of the most barbaric form of asymmetrical tribal rhythm to its most sophisticated peak. But that in and of itself is a huge revolution because it elevates the primacy of rhythm above that of melody, above that of harmony. We'd never had that before, and it really shocked its listeners. It's rock and roll for orchestra. What happens in the early 20th century is what I call the romantic hangover, where we have a whole slew of composers, Gustav Holst, Edward Elgar, Gabriel Fauré, Sergei Rachmaninoff, and Ralph Vaughan Williams, all composing anachronistically as if it was still the 1870s. They'd never adapted or adopted the avant-garde style of the next period. We now have to time jump to one of the strangest stories in the annals of music history, where music and politics coincide in a way that's never been experienced before or since. In 1937, Shostakovich composes his Fifth Symphony, which he subtitles, strangely, A Soviet Artist's Response to Just Criticism. What was the just criticism? His opera, Lady Macbeth in the Mtsensk district, which had been an absolute runaway hit on the stages of Russia, was seen by Stalin and summarily banned overnight because it was perverse and provocative. And it promoted petit bourgeois aesthetic ideals because it was about a woman refusing to be in the backwaters of Russia, subjugated by her authoritarian husband. The analogy to the government and the people was effortless. No wonder they loved it so much, and no wonder the authorities hated it so much. What we have as a result is a kind of regression of form and harmony and melody as demanded by political necessity. This third movement that I'm going to show you is Bernstein, oh no, it's me actually, conducting this elegiac middle movement where it was forbidden to express emotion in public in those days, and this gave voice to all of the people who had lost loved ones and friends and families to Siberian gulags, or who had simply been disappeared in the middle of the night and shot against the wall. Contrast to that, we have America at its absolute height of middle century affluence and strength, its ascension to the center of the world. And we have a return as a result to tonality and euphony, which is beautiful sounds. We have the sense of openness of these intervals. Pam, pam, pam. These open fifths that create this sense of possibility and space. And this is exemplified in Copland's beloved Appalachian Spring, which is asymmetrical like Stravinsky's ballet, but so easy and happy and sweet to listen to. American optimism. We have the post-war European pessimism, where there is a distrust of the establishment. There is a distrust of tradition. Look where it took us. It took us onto the verge of the abyss. It took us to the dropping of the only atomic weapons ever used in a war. It took us to the Holocaust. And so there is an abandonment of everything accepted and traditional, form, notation, and playing techniques. And a Polish composer named Penderecki composes this threnody, this memorial, this requiem for the victims of Hiroshima. It is very difficult to listen to. It is dissonant. It is high. It is unpleasant. What I encourage you to do is to sit and take deep breaths while you listen to this and put yourself in a moment in Hiroshima or in 9/11, very aptly for this week, where suddenly chaos reigns, and give yourself within the safety of your home a moment to go there in your mind to some of the most horrifying moments of recent human history. Then we see frenetic chaos in its wake. Very challenging piece of music. But one of the important functions of art is to give us the ability to reflect on such things in a visceral way so that we can find greater empathy and find greater compassion. We now jump forward 20 years and we see the infusion of pop and electronic music into classical music in the form of minimalism. We see the repetition of pop music. We see slow changes over a longer period, but with an active surface rhythm. Think about a guitar. It's very active, even though the harmony itself is static. But we also see in the classical world unusual instrumental combinations, but also the return of the triad, which is that euphonious, that pretty sound that is so familiar to all of us. This piece is called Music for 18 Musicians from the late 70s by Steve Reich. And it has these unusual combinations of microphoned voices and bass clarinets and marimbas, these unusual timbres and tone colors, all combined together with this very active surface rhythm. My dad came into my bedroom once when I was in my late teens and I was listening to that piece, and he was chatting to me, and then he cocked his ear and he said, "Is your CD scratched?" because he thought that it was just going round and round and round because he didn't know about minimalism. We now jump forward 40 years to the modern day, complete freedom with all elements of composition and creation. Michael Pollan, the great author and writer for the New York Times, wrote a book called The Omnivore's Dilemma, which he begins by saying, if we eat everything, then how do we answer the question, what's for dinner? With great freedom comes infinite choice and paralyzing indecision. One of the pieces that I'm performing tomorrow night at our concert with my orchestra is a piece by a living female composer who lives in Brooklyn. Her name is Missy Mazzoli. She was inspired by this image by Charles Sheeler of the River Rouge Ford plant in Detroit, where she said, or Sheeler said, he took photos of urban landscapes and imbued them with a kind of pastoral serenity, juxtaposing the actual reality with the sublimity of the photo. Here we have an enormous crisscrossed conveyor belt, which is carrying all of the grit and dirt and grime and small parts from different parts of the factory to each other, very, very noisy. But it looks like a huge cross that you might find outside a church. And likewise, the smokestacks in the background look like the enormous pipes of an organ. And so Missy saw this photo and composed River Rouge Transfiguration, in which she merges the grit and the grime and the dirt with these huge sonic and sonorous emissions from this vast organ. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is 1,000 years in 60 minutes.
I have to say, we were wondering if it could be done, and in fact, it was done. So thank you so much for that presentation there. Certainly, you can't touch on everything in the music world for the last 1,000 years, but very well done on it. I thought it was interesting too. You hear things, and to the untrained listener on it, you kind of notice things as you listen to it. You're like, oh, that's kind of suspenseful or stuff like that. But to have that deeper insight to say, here's the background on why it's there. This is where it's coming from. The chords and the not reconciling things later on and stuff like that. Just to get that inside knowledge. Thank you so much on that.
Yeah, what I like about this lecture, the reason I wrote it was because it was actually an introductory lecture to a series that I was giving. And I thought that a great way to give a background was to zoom out and have a look at how the whole picture unfolds. And I thought it was a really interesting exercise for me as well to start all the way at the very beginning with single line vocal music and to see how the arc unfolds. And some of the questions and comments that I've gotten as I've given this lecture many, many times is, what about this? And you didn't mention Tchaikovsky and whatever. And I said, the whole point of this lecture is very, very selective choice of people and pieces who moved and prompted music to evolve spontaneously into a new chapter. Tchaikovsky was undoubtedly a wonderful composer, but he didn't fundamentally change the aesthetic and the way that we receive music, the way that we interact with music, and the way that music was written. Wagner did that, Mahler did that, and then all the other guys that I mentioned. And then someone said, well, what about Eastern music, non-Western music? And I said, that's another lecture. This was about the very specific evolution of Western art music.
Absolutely. And as Paul mentioned here, if anyone has any questions, please feel free to put them into the chat or the Q&A. We got one question saying, will there be a link to this? Yes, it will be up on our YouTube page. So if you go to YouTube and type in Kendal at Home, you should see our page come up there, and you'll be able to find it there.
Hang on, see, this is my favorite. The first comment from Dean Seek was Russian composers seem to be conspicuously missing. So let me address that. As I say, Shostakovich was anachronistic. He started his career, the Fourth Symphony, which was withdrawn the night of its premiere because of the censure that he had received from the government, was a wildly experimental work that never saw the light of day in his lifetime because it was too risky. So Shostakovich is an anachronism. Mussorgsky was a pianist whose music was made famous by other representations like Ravel's orchestration. Tchaikovsky, as I said, did not really shift the needle forward. Prokofiev, again, was composing symphonies in the middle of the century anachronistically when other composers were composing avant-garde music. Rachmaninov was the greatest anachronist of all time because he was writing those glorious piano concerti in the 1930s, but it sounds like it's 1870. So none of them fit the requirements of this talk, which is who were the people that prompted spontaneous and lasting evolution within musical spheres. And so that's why I was so very selective. You'll notice I don't think there's one singer, at least Shostakovich makes an appearance. I don't think there's one Italian composer. And that's because opera is, again, a different genre. And I was focused largely on the evolution of notated Western art music. But I love these questions.
Yeah, and everyone chiming in the chat too is singing praise and thanking you for the presentation. It was very, very complete and everything. Got a question again. Was the rendering of Penderecki?
Penderecki, yeah.
Penderecki, the actual score or just a representation of the musical blending?
Great question. I didn't actually, I didn't clarify that. Thank you for asking. It's the actual score. And what you'll notice, what I'm sure you noticed, which is what prompted the very insightful question, is that we move away from traditional notation to visual notation. And that's one of the hallmarks of the late century, 20th century avant-garde, that they move away from the notes that we had been evolving from Hildegard through Josquin, finally through to Bach, where we solidify our musical notation. And that then becomes increasingly sophisticated and detailed over the course of the next 150 years. But then, exactly as you point out, Dean, in the middle and late 20th century, they abandoned this because they abandoned traditional expression. So it's what you noticed was the bar was moving in time, and he puts like second markings at the bottom. He says this section should last 10 seconds. This section should last 13 seconds. And there's a whole, at the beginning of the score, there's a whole big thing that says, this is what I mean by this marking. This is what I mean. They have to create their own graphic notation at the outset before the players can even play it. Mm-hmm. To your next question, where does Philip Glass? And Philip Glass is a minimalist. So the minimalists around the 1970s, Steve Reich was one of the really big ones, and Philip Glass was another one from that same era. And then Philip Glass continued to use a lot of popular influences in his music, hence his ultimate gravitation to film music. What we have as another offshoot of minimalism is John Adams, the great American composer who has composed both operas and huge symphonic works, where he takes the idea of minimalism, of repetition, and of slow color change over a long period of time, and he applies that to the orchestra. So John Adams is a wonderful place to go if you're interested in minimalism. John Adams is a great composer to look at because it's clothed in the garb of the symphony orchestra, but it's minimalist in its aesthetic.
Absolutely, and we got the one last comment here was that hopefully we'll venture into non-Western music in a future talk.
Given that I am an expert on Western classical art music, we shall leave that to someone else.
Very good. Well, Russell, thank you so much for joining us today and giving this wonderful presentation. I would like to also just let everyone know we do having our upcoming next presentation seminar is going to be on Tuesday, September 21st at 1 p.m. And it's going to be talking about balance and steps and fall prevention strategies to help you remain upright. So with our own Marla Gordon, our Director of Clinical Services. And you can find info for that as well as register for that on our website, kendalathome.org. So Russell, again, thank you so much.
Thanks very much for having me, folks.
And thank you all for joining today and looking forward to seeing you all at our next event.
Bye.